He was just a lonely rancher, a man whose heart had been buried with his family 10 years prior. But last night, in the fury of a biblical storm, he offered shelter to a desperate woman, pressing his father's old dagger into her hand for protection. Now, as dawn breaks, 200 silent Apache warriors line his fence, their painted faces promising a violent death. His act of kindness had just signed his death warrant. Welcome to Life Wild West. Here, we tell the stories etched into the dust and stone of a land that was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. If you believe that a man's true character is revealed not in times of comfort, but in the face of impossible odds, then you've found your campfire. Settle in and make sure you're subscribed, because the tales we tell are the very legends the West was built on. That dawn carried no birdsong. No familiar scent of sagebrush and dry grass rode the morning breeze. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence pressed down on the high plains, so thick that Elias Ward felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the first drop of blood to fall. He stood motionless inside his weathered gray cabin, a ghost in his own home. His calloused hand, a map of a hard-lived life, trembled slightly as it rested on a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He hadn't slept. How could he, when the wind itself had whispered warnings all night? Through the dusty, grime-streaked window, a sight stole the air from his lungs and sent a shard of ice racing down his spine. It wasn't a coyote or a wandering buffalo. It was an army. Hundreds of Apache warriors lined the rotting timbers of his fence, their bodies as still as the red rock cliffs behind them. Their faces were a fierce canvas of ochre and black, silent as living statues carved from vengeance itself. No one moved. No one spoke. They just stared, their collective gaze a physical force, pressing in on the solitary cabin, condemning it, and him, without a single word uttered. Elias was no stranger to the desert's profound loneliness, nor to the keening wail of the wind that howled through the canyons like a grieving mother. But he had never known a silence like this. It was the kind that crawled under your skin, the kind that promised a gruesome end to a single wrong move. A former soldier, a man who had tasted enough gunpowder and seen enough blood to last a dozen lifetimes, he understood one thing with chilling certainty. This kind of pregnant silence was infinitely more dangerous than the chaotic roar of battle. One burning question tore at his mind, a question that held the key to his survival. Why were they here? He was just an old rancher, a recluse who had walled himself off from the world for 10 long years. He spoke to no one, bothered no one. Why would they surround his home as if he were their most hated, sworn enemy? There was only one possible, terrifying explanation. The night before, the storm, the woman. He had opened his barn doors to a figure collapsing in the torrential rain, a woman whose eyes held the same wild terror as a cornered doe. He had given her shelter from the storm, a dry blanket, and pressed into her hand his father's old silver dagger so she could protect herself on her journey. And now, with 200 pairs of blazing, accusatory eyes fixed on his cabin, Elias finally understood. That woman was no ordinary wanderer. Elias Ward had lived alone on this harsh, unforgiving land for nearly a decade. His life had effectively ended the day his wife, Sarah, and their young son, Thomas, had succumbed to a brutal winter fever. He'd buried them himself on the small hill behind the ranch, their graves marked by 2 simple wooden crosses he'd carved with numb fingers. After that, he'd built his fences high and his walls even higher, locking his heart away as if it too had been buried in that cold, unforgiving earth. The townsfolk in the distant settlement called him the Old Wolf of the Dunes. It was half an insult, half a mark of grudging respect. For any man who could survive this long on the brutal frontier was not someone to be taken lightly. His small wooden cabin stood solitary in a vast sea of dry grass, its back pressed against the protective embrace of the red cliffs, its front opening onto plains that stretched clear to the horizon. His world was a simple, monotonous loop, the crow of roosters at dawn, the gentle neighing of his 2 horses, and the endless, lonely whistle of the wind. Over time, loneliness became his habit, and silence his only true companion. But the previous night, the sky had torn itself apart. The wind howled like a legion of demons, thunder split the darkness, and jagged forks of lightning slashed through the heavens. It was a storm that felt like the end of the world. While Elias was securing the horse stable, struggling against the gale, he caught sight of a figure staggering through the blinding sheets of rain. A woman. Her long, jet-black hair was plastered to her pale face, her leather dress soaked through, clinging to a frame that shuddered with cold and exhaustion. She moved as though each step was a monumental battle against some unseen, relentless enemy. "You need shelter," Elias had rasped, his voice nearly swallowed by the thunder. The woman turned, and in a brilliant flash of lightning, he saw her eyes. They were deep and dark, a maelstrom of fear and fierce defiance. She shook her head, her voice a desperate whisper carried on the wind. "I cannot stay. They will find me. My people will worry." But then another icy gust of wind struck, and her body trembled so violently he thought she might shatter. In that moment, Elias remembered his mother's words from a lifetime ago, a gentle voice from a kinder world. "When you see someone in need, son, you don't ask who they are. You just offer your hand." Without another thought, he unfastened the silver dagger at his belt. It wasn't just a weapon, it was the only thing he had left of his father, a man who had fallen at the Alamo. He placed its familiar weight into her trembling hand, then draped a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders. "Keep it until the storm clears," Elias said, his voice gruff to hide the sudden, unfamiliar stirring of compassion. She looked down at the dagger, her fingers tracing the worn carvings on the hilt, as though it was more than just steel, as though it carried the weight of a sacred oath. When she raised her eyes again, her gaze pierced him, and Elias felt as if his scarred, dormant heart had just been touched for the first time in a decade. "I will remember your name," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Elias Ward." Before he could even invite her into the warmth of the cabin, she vanished back into the tempest, melting into the rain and darkness like a ghost, leaving behind only hurried, desperate footprints in the mud. And this morning, the 200 Apache warriors standing silent beyond his fence were the answer to the mystery. That woman was no stranger. She was Naira, the wife of Chief White Crow, the fierce and revered leader of the Apache nation in this territory. Now Elias understood everything with terrifying clarity. He understood why the entire tribe looked upon him with such cold, murderous suspicion. His single, simple act of kindness had inadvertently sparked a storm far more dangerous than the one nature had unleashed the night before. The old wooden door of his cabin suddenly trembled with a heavy, rhythmic knock. Thump, thump, thump. Elias set down his coffee cup, the ceramic making a soft click against the wood table. His calloused hands clenched into tight fists. He knew it was only a matter of time. He had to face them. Outside, the horses of the war party stirred restlessly, their snorts and whinnies cutting through the tense silence. But the Apache warriors themselves remained still, silent as ghosts beneath the pale, rising sun. Then, a single figure stepped forward from their ranks. He was tall and broad-shouldered, draped in the pristine pelt of a white wolf. A crown of eagle feathers adorned his headdress, each one signifying an act of great bravery. His eyes were dark and unreadable, carrying the terrifying calm of a man who held the lives of hundreds in his hands. Elias Ward. The deep voice rang out, steady and sharp as flint, without a trace of hesitation. "You know why we are here." Elias drew a slow, deliberate breath, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. He met the chief's gaze head-on. "I do not," he answered, his voice rough from last night's whiskey and a lifetime of disuse. though his gaze did not waver. The chief gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if the reply only confirmed what he had already concluded. "I am White Crow, and the woman you met in the storm last night," his eyes narrowed, becoming sharp as spear points, "is my wife." The word struck Elias like a physical blow. The image of the trembling woman flashed in his mind, her hand clutching his dagger, her haunted eyes, her whispered warning. "If they know I am here, you will be in danger too." Elias swallowed the hard knot of fear in his throat and shook his head. She was lost, exhausted. I only gave her shelter from the rain. I swear, I did not know who she was. White Crow took a deliberate step closer, his presence as immense and intimidating as a thunderstorm rolling over the plains. The dagger in her hand, "It was yours." It was not a question. "Yes," Elias admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Only so she could defend herself. A ripple of murmurs spread through the line of warriors, like the wind stirring restless grass. Among the Apache, Elias now realized, a dagger was not merely a weapon. It was a symbol, a vow, a sacred bond of trust. For an outsider, a white man, to place such an object in the hands of a chief's wife was a profound transgression, an act that crossed into forbidden territory. White Crow's eyes narrowed further, searching Elias's face as though he could peel away every layer of deception to find the hidden truth. "Do you know," he said softly, his voice dangerously low, "that in our culture, a woman takes a weapon only from the one she trusts with her very life?" Silence, heavy and absolute, fell once more. A bead of sweat broke free and traced a path through the grime on Elias's brow, though the morning air was still cold. He hadn't meant to trespass on their sacred laws, but ignorance was no defense. The truth of his actions had dragged him into the heart of their world. From within the ranks, an angry voice suddenly shouted, "If Naira was here, then the white man knows where she is." The name cut the air like a blade. Naira. Now he knew her name, and he knew this was no longer a matter of a nameless act of kindness. This was personal. White Crow raised his hand, instantly silencing his warriors. His gaze locked onto Elias, a complex mix of judgment, accusation, and a desperate, hidden plea. "My wife vanished from our camp during the storm. She has not returned. And you, rancher, you are the last man to see her alive." Elias felt his hand drift instinctively toward the worn grip of the revolver holstered at his hip. In that single, heart-stopping instant, he understood. He was caught. Fate, in the form of a storm and a desperate woman, had bound him to a conflict from which there was no escape. He did not remember when he had agreed. Perhaps it was in that moment when White Crow's eyes met his, eyes that carried both a threat of annihilation and the desperate plea of a husband ready to turn the entire prairie into a sea of blood just to find the woman he loved. The old, lonely rancher had little left to lose. His life was a hollowed-out shell. Yet, the instinct to survive, the flicker of a flame that refused to be extinguished, would not let him refuse. And so, not long after, Elias Ward found himself astride a horse, riding not away from the Apache warriors, but among them, as they thundered north toward the unforgiving land of stone and forest. The wind swept through the cactus thickets, carrying with it the rhythmic pounding of hundreds of hooves that sounded like the drums of war. Elias could feel the wary, hostile gazes of the warriors around him. They watched him as though he were a condemned man being escorted to the gallows, a snake they were forced to carry in their midst. Yet strangely, deep inside his chest, Elias felt more alive than he had in a decade. For so long his mornings had been nothing but the mindless routine of milking his cow and mending fences. His nights were spent drowning in cheap whiskey, a futile attempt to forget the crushing emptiness. Now, under the cold, lethal stares of 100 eyes, his heart beat fast and hard, like it had in his youth when he carried a rifle into the heart of battle. We are all on a journey, wrestling with the ghosts of our past and the uncertainty of our future. If these tales of the trail resonate with the adventurer in your soul, let me know in the comments what courage means to you. Your stories fuel this campfire." The riders halted near a sparse cluster of cottonwood trees. White Crow dismounted with the fluid grace of a predator, bending low, his weathered fingers brushing over faint marks in the dry mud near the creek bed. He spoke softly in his native tongue to his led scout, then turned his dark eyes to Elias. "Naira's tracks. She passed here, but she was not alone." Elias slid down from his saddle, his old bones protesting. He strained his eyes to see what the chief saw. Indeed, pressed deep into the earth beside her smaller, lighter footprints were the heavy tracks of booted men. The memory of Naira in the storm surged back, her eyes wild with fear, her constant panicked glances over her shoulder. Elias understood then. She hadn't been running from her husband, she had been running from someone else. "She was afraid," Elias murmured, the words a revelation spoken almost to himself. "Not of me, she was being chased." White Crow gave a brief, sharp nod, a rare flicker of agreement in his obsidian gaze. "You saw what I did not. Perhaps you do not lie about everything." The small admission did little to soften the hatred in the other warrior's eyes, but it planted a strange seed within Elias, the feeling of being heard. For 10 years, no one had cared for his words. For 10 years, not even he had bothered to listen to himself. That night, they camped by a whispering stream. Elias sat alone by the fire, turning an old, unlit pipe between his hands. The familiar gesture a small comfort in a world turned upside down. He listened to the soft breathing of the horses, to the men speaking in a language he only half understood, their voices rising and falling like the rhythm of the land itself. In that moment, he realized he was standing on the border between two worlds. One was the world of crushing loneliness that had been his prison for a decade. The other was a world of fierce, dangerous, but unbreakable kinship. And caught between them was a mysterious woman who carried a storm in her shadow. Elias finally lit his pipe, drew a long breath of smoke, and lifted his eyes to the vast, star-dusted sky. He knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that if Naira was still alive, he would have to follow this bloody trail with them to its very end. Not just to save her, or even himself, but to uncover why fate had dragged him, a forgotten hermit, into this deadly game of life and death. By noon the next day, the sun poured fire onto the prairie, scorching the earth and baking the air until it shimmered. White Crow's party rode into a narrow, winding canyon, its red rock cliffs rising sheer on both sides, the wind screaming through the passage like a funeral trumpet. A primal chill ran down Elias's spine. His soldier's instincts, long dormant, were now screaming. He had seen many battlefields, and he knew this truth as well as he knew his own name. Where silence lingered too long and too deep, death was lying in wait. Suddenly, a high-pitched whistle cut the air. An arrow zipped past his head, striking hard into a tree trunk just inches from his face, the shaft quivering from the force of the impact. An instant later, savage war cries exploded from the cliffs above. Shadows leapt from the rocks, and a rain of arrows and spears came down upon them like a deadly storm. "Ambush!" an Apache warrior shouted, his voice nearly lost in the sudden chaos. The riders scattered at once, raising shields and drawing bows in a desperate, frantic defense. Elias threw himself from his horse, rolling and pressing his body flat against a large boulder, his hand already reaching for the worn, familiar stock of the rifle at his side. The sharp crack of his gunfire split the chaos, smoke filling the canyon, mingling with the screams of men and the shrill, terrified cries of horses. But amidst the torrent of arrows and the thunder of hooves, Elias's sharp, trained eye caught something terribly wrong. One of the Apache warriors, a man named Kyle, who had been staring at him with particular venom, was not fighting with the same panic as the others. Standing on a ledge slightly above the fray, he moved his hands in subtle, almost invisible gestures. They were signals, clear and practiced, battle signs. "Betrayal," Elias muttered, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He sprang to his feet, ignoring the arrows zipping past him, and roared toward White Crow. "Look there! On the ledge!" "One of your own, he is guiding them." White Crow's gaze snapped to where Elias pointed. For a fraction of a second, disbelief warred with understanding on the chief's face, before it twisted into a mask of cold, absolute fury. Without a word, he drew his own bow, nocked an arrow, and loosed it with the force of a thunderclap. The arrow flew true, striking deep into the traitor's shoulder and flinging him from the cliff with a choked cry. The cries of the ambushers faltered, their attack losing its coordination, shaken by the sudden, unexpected exposure of their inside man. Seizing the moment of hesitation, the loyal Apache warriors counterattacked with brutal, vengeful force. Elias, though long removed from real combat, felt the old rhythms return. He steadied his rifle, took aim, and fired, cutting down an enemy warrior whose spear had been aimed directly for White Crow's exposed flank. That feeling of betrayal cuts deeper than any blade, doesn't it? It can turn a brother into an enemy and a sanctuary into a trap. If you're on the edge of your seat, holding your breath right alongside Elias, make sure you're subscribed, because the trail of vengeance is just getting started, and it leads to even darker places. When the dust began to settle, the canyon was littered with corpses, the metallic stench of blood heavy in the hot air. The surviving ambushers had fled into the labyrinth of rocks, but through the groans of the wounded, Elias heard something that froze him still. The fallen traitor, Kyle, was not yet dead. Gasping for breath, his lifeblood staining the red dust, he whispered a single name. Naira. Elias dropped to his knees beside the dying man, clutching his shoulder. "Where is she? Tell me." The traitor's lips twisted into a ragged, bloody smile. "She is the bait," he coughed, blood bubbling from his mouth. "And you, the noble chief, you have all walked into the trap." His eyes went wide, then glazed over, dimming to nothing. Elias lifted his head and met White Crow's darkened, smoldering stare. He knew then that this ambush was only the beginning. Their enemy, whoever they were, did not merely seek to capture the chief's wife. They wanted to shatter the Apache tribe from the inside out. And now Elias, the lone rancher, had been drawn so deep into this bloody game that a single misstep would cost him not just his life, but the fate of an entire people. The smoke still clung to the canyon walls, a bitter incense on the sun-scorched stone. White Crow stood in a grim silence over the traitor's body, his face an unreadable mask of stone, though his eyes burned like embers buried deep in ash. He gave no order for burial, spoke no word of mourning for the man who had been his brother. Instead, he turned to Elias, his voice low and rough as gravel. "You have seen it. There are those within my own tribe who would sell their blood for power. And my wife, she is in their hands." Elias wiped a mixture of sweat and gunpowder dust from his brow, his heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He wanted no part of this. All he wanted was his quiet, lonely life back. Yet, in White Crow's gaze, he saw more than just the anger of a betrayed chief. He saw the raw, primal pain of a man terrified of losing the one person he loved most in the world. It was a pain Elias knew all too well, a ghost that had haunted him since the day he buried his wife and son beneath the same cold mound of earth. "Where have they taken her?" Elias asked, his voice hoarse. White Crow bent to the ground, his eyes scanning the chaotic tracks. He traced a faint print, almost lost in the scuffed dirt. Smaller footsteps, dragged hastily, mixed with the heavy boots of many men. "They head west," he said, his voice grim. "To the Valley of Horsebones." The name sent a visible shudder through several of the nearby warriors. Elias glanced at them, not understanding the name, but their pale faces told him everything he needed to know. That valley was a cursed place, a place whispered about in hushed, fearful tones. It was where an entire cavalry patrol had once been swallowed whole by a sudden violent sandstorm, leaving nothing behind but the bleached bones of men and their mounts. The Apache believed the vengeful spirits of those soldiers still wandered there, screaming in the wind. They chose that valley because they believe our fear will keep us away, White Crow continued, his voice hardening into steel. But I will go, and you, Elias Ward, will go with me. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle slung across his shoulder. He could have refused. He could have turned back toward his lonely ranch and left them to their fate. But the image of Naira in the storm returned with blinding clarity, the terror in her eyes, her trembling hand clutching his dagger as if it were her last hope in a hostile world. She had not only taken a relic of his family, she had carried with her an unspoken promise. "Very well," Elias said simply, the two words sealing his fate. "I will go." Moments like these define a man, forcing him to choose between the safety of the world he knows and the dangerous path of doing what is right. What do you think is going through Elias's mind right now? Is it fear, or has this quest reawakened a part of him he thought was long dead? Drop your thoughts below, and let's discuss the heart of a true frontiersman. That night, as the depleted party camped at the forest's edge, Elias sat alone by the fire, lost in thought. White Crow approached soundlessly and sat beside him, setting down a small leather pouch. Inside was a silver necklace, intricately carved with the shape of a crow in flight. "And Naira's," the chief said, his voice softer now. "She would never abandon it unless she was forced. Wear it. Perhaps it will help you remember her face and why we fight when the time comes." Elias closed his fingers around the cool metal pendant, its unexpected weight a comfort in his palm. He looked at the Apache chief, the same man who just hours before would have killed him without hesitation. Now they sat side by side, sharing the warmth of the same fire, bound by a shared fear and a shared, desperate purpose. In that quiet moment, Elias understood. He was no longer the forgotten rancher, a ghost lost in the emptiness of the prairie. He was part of this search. He was part of the tribe's fate, and the road to the Valley of Horsebones would decide not only Naira's future, but whether he would ever find his own way back to the world of the living. The road into the Valley of Horsebones was like a descent into hell. The wind screamed a constant, maddening shriek, whipping red dust into blinding clouds that stung the eyes and choked the throat. Bleached white bones of horses and men lay scattered across the ground like grim, forgotten signposts marking death's territory. Riding among the silent, tense Apache warriors, Elias felt his chest tighten. He thought of the two small graves on the hillside back at his ranch, of the decade of solitude he had spent hiding a shattered heart. For the first time in a long time, he was fighting for something more than just his own survival. A cry suddenly rose from the front of the column. "Tracks!" White Crow spurred his horse forward, pointing to clear drag marks etched into the sand. The riders surged after him, their horses' hooves thundering through the cursed valley. And there, at the valley's end, they saw her. Naira was bound to a crude wooden post, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes, even from a distance, still burned with an unquenchable fire. Around her stood the remaining traitors, their leader a hulking man with a cruel sneer, their blades gleaming in the dying light. The two sides faced each other in the blood-red glow of the setting sun, a tableau of hatred and desperation. "Lay down your weapons, White Crow," the lead traitor shouted, his voice laced with mocking arrogance. "Kneel and confess your weakness, and your wife lives." The air grew taut, stretched as tight as a bowstring. Then, to everyone's surprise, Elias urged his horse forward, his rough, weathered voice echoing through the canyon. "You are mistaken. This woman is not a bargaining chip. She is proof that honor and loyalty are things you can never trade away." The words, spoken by a nameless, solitary rancher, fell over the valley like a thunderclap. For a single, stunned heartbeat, silence reigned. White Crow turned to Elias, his eyes flashing with something between shock and profound respect. The battle erupted with savage fury. But this time, Elias no longer felt like an outsider. He charged into the fray, his rifle speaking with deadly authority. He cut down an archer who was aiming for Naira, then spurred his horse to the post, slashing through her bindings with his own knife. Naira collapsed into his arms for a brief moment, her eyes blazing with trust. "I knew you would come, Elias Ward," she breathed. When the dust finally settled, the traitors lay dead or bound, and Naira was safe within the protective circle of her people. White Crow came to Elias, placing a heavy, firm hand on his shoulder. His voice was as resonant as a war drum. "You have saved my wife, but you have done more than that. You have saved the honor of our tribe. From this day on, Elias Ward, you are no longer the lone man of the prairie. You are our brother." Elias said nothing. He simply watched as the setting sun painted the sky, listening as the wind carried the victory songs of the warriors. In that moment, he understood kindness, even the smallest, most insignificant act, could bend the course of fate. A dagger offered in a storm had not only saved a life, it had redeemed a broken man and given him back his own. The sun finally sank behind the distant mountains, leaving the valley of Horsebones to the gathering shadows and the stars. The Apache warriors gathered around their victory fire, their drums and songs a powerful testament to their survival, echoing through the vast open air. In the circle of flickering flame and deep shadow, Elias Ward sat in silence. His hand was wrapped tightly around his father's dagger, now returned to him. Upon its scarred steel blade, the firelight glimmered as though retelling the incredible story that had just been written in blood and courage. White Crow approached, with Naira walking gracefully beside him. The chief's face still bore the hard lines of hardship, but his eyes shone with a fierce pride. He placed that same firm hand on Elias's shoulder, his deep voice both solemn and warm. "From this day, you are no longer a stranger to us. You have shed blood with our warriors. You have risked your life for one of our own. Elias Ward, you have a place at this fire, always." Naira tilted her head, her dark eyes resting on Elias with a look that was no longer filled with the terror of the storm, but with profound gratitude and respect. She gently placed the silver crow necklace back into his hand. "Keep it," she said softly, "so that you always remember that on a night of darkness and fear, you chose mercy instead of turning away." Elias hesitated for a moment, his calloused hand trembling slightly as he closed it around the cool, heavy pendant. For so many years, he had locked himself inside a prison of grief, believing there was no place left for him in this world. Yet tonight, beneath the firelight and surrounded by the proud voices of the tribe, he saw the truth. Even the smallest act of kindness could open a door, guiding a lost man from the deepest darkness back into the light. He lifted his eyes to the burning, star-filled sky, and for the first time in 10 years, allowed himself a faint, genuine smile. "Perhaps I am not alone anymore," he thought. The Apache rode out with the rising sun, carrying with them the legend of an old, lonely rancher who dared to stand on the edge of life and death for the sake of honor. And from that day on, across the harsh frontier, people began to speak of Elias Ward by a new name, Brother of the White Crow. In the storm-torn, unforgiving West, sometimes a single choice, offering a hand in the rain, placing a dagger into another's grasp, can change the course of destiny forever. Elias Ward had lost everything he ever loved. Yet through an unexpected act of mercy, he found a family greater than he could have imagined and a reason to truly live again. Thank you for riding along with us here on Life Wild West. If this story of courage and unlikely brotherhood moved you, share it with a friend who loves a good old-fashioned tale of the frontier, and be sure to hit that notification bell. Because every soul out here on the prairie has a story waiting to be told, and we'll be back with another one very soon.